Right, okay, what I'm going to do, I think this is probably going to be the last in this series. I'm just going to look at the duration maps and how they appear to function and what they're doing. Before we look at those, just going to look at the map choice for duration when I can get it to stay on the screen. Right, okay, here we go. Here's the map choice. It's being chosen on the basis of start of injection. So if I just double click on that quickly, I've got a factor that we've used before, 0.023437. So you'll have seen that on various other videos if you've watched any of mine. And over here I've got minus 78, which simply allows these figures to appear as after top dead center. They're not used on all ECU files, but they seem to be being used on this one. Now these figures are either after top dead center, as in minus, so that one is minus 4 degrees after top dead center, or they could be read as before top dead center, and we'll just simply call that 4 degrees and ignore the minus. Now this is where most of the action is taking place most of the time. So most of the time start of injection is somewhere up in these figures, so probably using these maps a lot of the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look at map 1 as a nice simple choice of map. So I'm going to go back to here and double click on map 1, and that's the one I'll use as my example. Now make it slightly bigger. Now I could look at it in 3D mode, and if I do that though, it's a little bit more difficult to explain what's going on in the figures, so I'll probably keep that in text view. Now, as in many of these maps, the two things are basically the same, in that if you increase the injection quantity, you're also increasing the revs per minute. So whichever way you look at it, you can almost only look at this one and not worry too much about revs, because you know if this one is rising, that one obviously is at the same time. So basically what we're really looking at is a pattern that runs somewhere across the middle, almost as a diagonal across here, because we've got injection quantity going up and we've got revs per minute going up, and so somewhere in the middle will be the amount of time being allowed for the injected quantity to occur to give that number of revs per minute. And if we look at these figures, what we've got here, let's just pick a particular spot. It doesn't really matter which, but it might be simpler to just run down one particular spot or run across one particular spot. So if we pick a figure, let's say here we've got 10 milligrams. So okay, let's consider injecting 10 milligrams. So we'll go across and we look, and 10 milligrams, depending on the revs, we don't want to look at these really low ones because they're obviously not practical in real life. So 10 milligrams, if we come across here to somewhere in the region of 1,000, 1,200 revs per minute, you can see it's 8.51, 7.76. So 10 milligrams is taking somewhere around about 8 degrees of crankshaft rotation. So 10 milligrams, 8 degrees. Now, as it revs up and gets faster and faster and faster, you can see that the amount of time being allowed to inject this amount is actually reducing. Or the time in degrees is reducing, so the number of degrees is reducing. Now, that is not altogether surprising, is it? Because it's just struggling to get the fuel in that space of time, and obviously the faster the engine is turning, the more difficult that will be. There isn't an obvious relationship, as in if I want twice as much fuel I'll need twice as much time, but there is a difference obviously. So if I compare 10 and I look at 10 and I come across here and I say, right, there we are, look, there's 10, and we're looking in the region of 8. If I then go, the next one is 15, so if I go to the next one, which is 20, you can see 20 is somewhere around about 10.27, 10.38, so that's the time in degrees. And if I double from 20 to 40, then when I get to 40, I find that it's taking somewhere around about 15 to 15.5. So basically the pattern is obvious, but it's not obvious in terms of the multiplication of increase. In other words, I can't simply say to add twice as much fuel will take twice as long, but it does take longer. So the more fuel I want to inject, the longer it will take me. It's as simple as that. And that means that when I inject more fuel, I'll need more time, so duration will get longer. And if duration gets longer, start of injection will have to occur earlier. So when it comes to duration and start of injection, they are intimately linked. You cannot change one without affecting the other, and it's up to you to decide which one you think is the one you want to change the most. Now, most people do not start out thinking, oh, I will change start of injection, because most people think that if they want more power from their engine, they need to inject more fuel. And in order to inject more fuel, they are going to have a longer period of duration. That's fairly sensible, isn't it? That's fairly obvious. But if they have a longer period of duration, they are going to have to change the start of injection. Now, this isn't always the case though, because although that is quite clear, that is what you would have to do, before you ever consider touching duration and start of injection maps, have a good look first to make sure that you're not needlessly making changes that you don't actually need. In other words, this map is like a measuring map for the ECU to decide what to do. Now at the moment the ECU, as we've seen in some of the videos that I've put out on here, this ECU is using absolute maximum somewhere around about 50 or 52 milligrams per stroke to get its best revs per minute. But the scale on here runs to 60 milligrams. So if a tuner were to change figures to allow for 60 milligrams injection, they would not need to change the duration maps because 60 milligrams is available. It's already on here. So any change they make that involves 60 milligrams, that's okay, because 60 milligrams, the ECU knows what to do. It can simply look up 60 as a reference on here, and it can say, right, 60 I need, and here we've got a choice of different amounts of time, haven't we? But it's around about 25, 28, 29. So that sort of amount, so around about that sort of amount of time to inject. So the figures for 60 milligrams are already here. And what that means is that for a fairly simple tune on an ECU such as this, you would not need to touch duration and you would not need to touch start of injection. You would only need to touch those if you were considering trying to go outside the bounds that the developers have already put on the maps. And once you go outside those bounds, you are moving into unknown territory, and that's when you risk doing some sort of damage to your engine, which is why it's always a good idea not to touch these without looking on forums and places like that to see what other people have already tried. Because unless you want to be the guinea pig, or you want your car to be the guinea pig, it's probably better to check to see what other people have successfully tried. And if they can give you some values that they have successfully tried, then there's a reasonable chance you can use those without damaging your car. Of course, if you want to try something that no one else has tried, then you are the guinea pig and you will have to live with the consequences. Right, I think that's probably enough information on that one, so I will stop there.